commission, and he told me that two members of the planning commission, they are positive, and maybe other few joint secretaries and under secretaries. Okay, he doesn't have idea about how many people are infected. In planning commission, and he simply told me, and there are many people infected. And in Ministry of Industry Commerce, just well, one of the officials told me maybe more than 20% are positive right now.
Oh, really?
Sorry, 20. More than 20 officials. Ministry of Commerce, and they are positive.
Well, our Minister for Planning has recently been infected. Mr.
Your minister, okay, your minister also.
Yes.
Yes.
He was going quite active and going to his constituency quite a lot.
Santi, after 10 minutes, can you give me soup, please?
Talk shows.
One cup with salt.
Paras,
6 now?
Yes.
Only
Paras now it's 501.
Yes.
Little bit fries.
Let participant in.
Fries.
And
French
let's
fries have
start.
one in the fridge, but don't fry all. Little bit, because Baba has to eat with me 8 o'clock. Huh? Just 3 meatballs, little bit fries.
So how much time do I have? What is my time limit?
I think it's 10 to 12 minutes.
Yes, 10 to 12 minutes.
Okay.
And the other panelists have 8 to 10 minutes.
If you kindly agree, I want to give my 5 minutes to Professor Hemant Sohan.
Oh, I see.
Sure.
I see. That would be very kind, but is this permissible?
I think so, sir. It's a mutual arrangement, sir.
Time is not transferable.
I will try to do my thing in 15 minutes.
Okay.
Hi, Posh.
Hi.
This is Mustafiz.
Hi, sir. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you.
Oh.
Tell me,
Okay.
what is the news of
Okay.
Sridhar Khatri?
Sridhar Khatri. Well, I have not met him, for a long time, but I think he's in Kathmandu. And I saw, on interview, his interview newspaper, that's it.
I see.
But I guess, he's in Kathmandu.
And is my old friend Mohan Sanju still there?
Yeah, he is still there, but he's sick.
He's sick.
Yeah.
So sorry, everyone. So we will start now.
And your, old friend, Dr. Devendra Raj Pandey, he's fine. He's fine.
He's fine.
I just talked to him maybe a few days back, 2-3 days back. He is fine.
So
Well,
Dr. Pandey.
Please give him a call and convey my best regards to him.
Sure, sir.
So Dr. Pandey, Dr. Rehman, everyone will start now. And I'll just welcome you all. Okay. So let's start. A warm welcome to you all to the 8th and final edition of the webinar series on COVID and South Asia. South Asia Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment has been organizing it in association with Biruni Institute, Afghanistan, Center for Policy Dialogue, Bangladesh, Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS, India, Sustainable Development Policy Institute, Pakistan, and Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka. We have discussed over the last 7 sessions a range of topics from the implications of COVID to the international world order, globalization from the perspective of South Asia, e-commerce, tourism, foreign direct investment, labor and migration, climate change, among others. Today, the theme is Future of Development Finance and South Asia's Development, as the economic fallout from the pandemic makes mobilizing resources for sustainable development goals, as well as development purposes in general, even more challenging. It's a cross-cutting theme that touches on all the topics covered so far and perhaps even beyond. We have a lineup of eminent panelists today, as before. Now, without further ado, let me introduce the moderator of today's session, Ms. Amina Arif. She is the Country Manager, International Finance Corporation, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. She has had a varied career in banking before she joined IFC in 2012 in Pakistan. She has worked in international banks such as Citibank, ABN AMRO, among others. She has worked in challenging, fragile, and post-conflict markets, working specifically on key relationships and projects in sustainable energy finance, SME, and digital financial services, among other things. In short, she is a person well-versed in the ins and outs of finance, including its development dimension. Over to you, Ms. Ari.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karel, and welcome to everyone who's joined us today. I think we have such a distinguished panel here that really we're going to run out of time, I know, even before we start, but I'm very excited to hear from them. So let me begin by thanking Dr. Sharma and Swati for organizing this timely discussion and also for inviting me to moderate today's session. So as was explained, I'm the country manager for IFC covering Sri Lanka and Maldives. I myself am from Pakistan, so I have familiarity at least with a chunk of South Asian countries. I've worked in Afghanistan as well, so I'm very excited to hear from the different panelists about these markets. Just to give you a bit of background on what we do, IFC is a member of the World Bank Group. We are the largest development institution in the world focused on the private sector in developing countries. We work in more than 100 countries using our capital, expertise, and our influence, as well as our convening power, to create markets and opportunities in emerging markets. In fiscal 2020, IFC invested $22 billion in private companies and financial institutions in developing countries, leveraging the power of the private sector to end extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity. Those are our goals: an end to extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. In Sri Lanka, as we celebrate 50 years of operations this year, we marked our largest investment in the country by far, investing over $300 million in Sri Lanka in spite of the ongoing pandemic. Before we begin our discussion, I think some housekeeping rules. Please mute your microphones when you're not talking so as to avoid disturbance and allow us all to hear our eminent panelists. To all who've joined us, we will have a round of questions at the end. And I think if you can post them on chat, and Swati is going to help us make sure we don't miss any. So despite a tremendous increase in the number of initiatives dedicated to sustainable development, there's still an estimated financing gap of $2.5 trillion that stands in the way of achieving the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals that all our countries have signed on for. A closer look at the sectoral level reveals significant investment gaps, with some of the largest funding needs related to economic infrastructure. At up to $950 billion, power infrastructure carries the greatest financing need, followed by climate change mitigation, close to $850 billion, and transport infrastructure, about $770 billion. So these are really mind-boggling numbers, but these are the estimates that we have to work with. These are how gaps have been quantified. Other than this, there are also sizable investment gaps in social infrastructure, ranging from $140 billion in health to $250 billion in education. And health, as you can imagine, is on top of everyone's mind these days. I think even those who didn't now recognize that health is not just a social good, but also an economic good. Asia continues to face a massive development financing gap, particularly in the areas of infrastructure. The Asian Development Bank in 2017 estimated a financing gap in this area of $459 billion per year, or about 2.4% of developing Asia's GDP. And if you add the social infrastructure gap, the total shortfall was huge even before COVID hit. With current pandemic, governments are facing a double whammy: declining revenue and increasing demand for more social spending. With COVID-19 very much out there in South Asia, the crisis has brought the region to a near standstill in some cases. The latest World Bank South Asia focus, which came out just a week ago, forecasts a sharper than expected economic slump in South Asia, with regional growth expected to contract by 7.7% in 2020. after topping or growing by 6% annually over the last 4 years. In previous recessions, excuse me, falling investment and exports have led the downturn. This time is different, as private consumption, traditionally the backbone of demand in South Asia and a core indicator of economic welfare, is expected to decline by more than 10%, further spiking poverty rates. 3/4 of all workers in South Asia depend on informal employment, especially in hospitality, retail trade, and transport, sectors that are most affected by containment measures governments have taken. All of these could affect countries' abilities to meet. Firstly, the limited domestic resources, the very narrow space to further develop these resources, and again, a really tight fiscal space have constrained government's ability to fund effective response and recovery measures, therefore endangering previous development gains. So this is not just, how can we move on? This is how do we protect all that we have invested in so far? Moreover, inadequate response at this time will lead to a longer economic downturn, which will be detrimental to their development goals. Also, a grim prospect of external financing in the form of reduced FDI, smaller remittance inflows, and reduced official development assistance, ODA, doesn't bode well for development objectives. Now, more than ever, it's a time to look at what needs to be done to increase the level of development finance to address these large financing gaps. On that note, let us begin our conversation on the future of development finance with a focus on South Asia, which faces paramount development challenges, as we're all very well aware of. With that, let me invite Professor Shobhan. He's the chairman of the Center for Policy Dialogue in Dhaka, and he's going to be presenting the keynote address. Let me try to take a minute to introduce him. He has such a distinguished career that it's hard to summarize it, but I'm going to try and do my best. So Professor Shobhan has served as Professor of Economics, Dhaka University, Member Bangladesh Planning Commission, Director General Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies, Visiting Fellow Queen Elizabeth House, Oxford, Founder and Executive Chairman, Center for Policy Dialogue, CPD, Executive Director, South Asia Center for Policy Studies, and is currently Chairman, CPD. In 1991, he served as a member of the first caretaker government headed by President Shahabuddin Ahmed. He has held a number of important professional positions, which include President, Bangladesh Economic Association, Member UN Committee for Development Planning, Member Governing Council of the UN University, Tokyo, Member of the group of eminent persons appointed by the SAARC heads of state to review the future of SAARC, and Chairman of the Board of Grameen Bank. He has published a large number of books, research monographs, and articles published in professional journals relating to the political economy of development, public enterprise and privatization, foreign aid, petropolitics, agrarian reform, regional cooperation across South Asia, democracy, and governance. His most recent works include Challenging the Injustice of Poverty, Agendas for Inclusive Development in South Asia. His memoir, Untranquil Recollections, The Years of Fulfillment, published in 2015, and From Two Economies to Two Nations, My Journey to Bangladesh. So, Professor Shobhan, it's indeed a pleasure and a privilege to be here to listen to you today. So I'm passing it on to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would once again like to express my thanks and appreciation to Oshraj Pandey and his colleagues at Swati for continuing this sustained discussion on South Asia. My recent concerns have been the virtual disappearance of South Asia from both intellectual and policy conversations, and the fact that you have in fact kept the idea of South Asia alive and have renewed discussion on this, I think has been a matter of great reassurance to me. Now, I circulated a background paper, which in fact was dated 2012. And of course, it dealt with the discussions which were going on in the UN system. It was prepared for UN DESA for innovative sources of financing. But the general issue was, again, at that time, the constraints in accessing financing and the search for innovative instruments, if any such concept actually exists. That was not the main burden of my discussion. The main burden of my discussion for the Asian region was to, in fact, actually identify certain structural changes which had, in fact, taken place over the course of the last 10 to 20 years in the Asian region on the nature of development finance. And this itself reflected certain structural changes in the global economy, which needed to be taken into account when we were addressing the future of development finance. Now, in circulating this over here, what I had wanted to point out is that the structural issues that I had identified all the way back almost a decade ago seem to be still alive and well in the region, and particularly in South Asia. And the global contextual changes which had taken place also seem to be there. And in fact, if anything else, the trends that I've identified at that particular period of time have in fact been accentuated. So that whilst the paper itself in terms of its numbers may be somewhat out of date, the issues seem to be alive and well. And all we need to do is to really update the numbers. I tried to reassure myself on this over the last day or two by using my limited capacity to use the internet to see how the data looked today. And I must say that virtually all the trends that we identified at that time seem to, in fact, have been reinforced with the passage of time. Now, let me identify some of the significant structural changes, which, in fact, I had brought on the table at that particular period, and which seem now to be more relevant than ever. And of course, some of these elements have been further accentuated in the COVID world in which we exist and its prospective aftermath. My address will be more addressed to the possibilities of the way the world will be developing, and within it, South Asia, in this period following, assuming at some point that some element of normalcy will be restored. Now, the main features I identified earlier on, which seem very much the case today, is that for all South Asian countries, with perhaps the exception of Afghanistan, there has been a very steady and decline in dependence on ODA. In fact, for most countries now, they are barely dependent on ODA at all. Nepal still has some degree of dependence, but even compared to the numbers I had put on the table in 2012, they have now reduced their dependence. Correspondingly, there has been considerable improvement in remittance flows. I had identified in that particular period how there had been a structural change in the external financing process, moving from aid dependence to, you may say, remittance dependence on, in fact, really strengthening the balance of payments and enhancing our import capabilities. This trend has, in fact, continued over the years, and remittance still remains the main source of external inflows. FDI dependence, again, for South Asia had remained very limited at that time. The only country which, in fact, had made any considerable use of FDI and which has improved its inflows, but which still, in terms of its GDP, remains low, was, of course, India. Other countries of South Asia have again had very low dependence on FDI. This has again thrown the burden on domestic sources of financing. Again, those trends were emerging. I was noticing at that time that there had been rise in rates of savings GDP ratios. There had been rise, small degree, I think Nepal was one of the success stories, in the revenue GDP ratios for internal financing. But some countries, and particularly Bangladesh, still remain very much below their potential over here. Even though in quantitative terms, because of the big rise in GDP, the resources coming into the public exchequer have increased considerably. And correspondingly, of course, this has led to a considerable improvement in the investment GDP ratios in all South Asian countries. Now, part of this and part of the savings in GDP ratios have been, of course, driven by the numbers associated with the migrant remittances. And of course, the conversion of remittances into investments gives you, of course, a slightly sort of false impression of the fact that all these remittances have been transferred into investment assets, which is not actually the case. Because one of the problems has been, and one of our big failures has been, to convert remittances into effective investment. Now, the other feature I had pointed out at that particular time was, of course, the changing global economy. We were witnessing the rise of Asia, led by China, in terms of becoming the center for global trade, and from that becoming the center for global finance. In 2012, these trends had already manifested themselves and were already indicating that the Asian region was fast overtaking Europe and North America. Now, by the time we get to 2020, we have seen a much bigger change in terms of the share of global trade, in terms of the share of global GDP, and of course, in terms of the share of global foreign exchange reserves, including the sovereign wealth funds, which in fact have made, together with the reserves, made Asia into the principal source of external financial flows in the world. Whilst the multilateral institutions have in fact been attempting to keep up, they are still a long way behind the targets they set themselves, and they periodically repeat themselves in those targets. I think at the moment, the latest numbers indicate that global flows are about $187 billion, of which I think 115 are bilateral, 72 billion or 38% are for multilateral. But again, a greater share of the multilateral financing is coming from what are known as sort of dedicated funds, where the donors, in fact, have laid down specific areas in which resources are to flow. So core financing itself remains constrained. In terms of regional flows, Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, by 2012 had overtaken South Asia as becoming the principal recipient of ODA. So that in the South Asian region itself, if you look at the world, we have low dependence on aid. We are getting insufficient inflows of FDI. And at the same time, we have been becoming increasingly sort of self-reliant in terms of financing our own development. Now, what is emerging and what has already manifested itself in 2012 was, of course, the emergence of Asia as a source of finance. We had already seen at that time that countries like China were already becoming contributors to ODA and were contributing also to what would be called a sort of mix of soft and hard loans. I think it is now called official financing in the way in which the OOFs, as they call it, rather than ODA, in which you're not getting soft money, but you are actually getting government-directed financial resources coming in. And this has now become the major player in the game. Today, a country like China has, of course, about $3.5 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserves, and again about $1 trillion in its sovereign wealth funds. And these, along with the sovereign wealth funds and reserves of the West Asian countries and some of the Southeast Asian countries, and now also some Central Asian countries, is in fact now a major new resource which has really come into the global scene. And it is going to be my argument that this is going to become, over the course of the next decade, the major factor in determining global financial flows into the South Asian region. Here, I would like to quickly go on to say that in this changing world order, the advantage of the Asian region's financial flows is in fact very dependent on the fact that those who have been accumulating sovereign wealth funds and foreign exchange reserves in the East Asian and Southeast Asian region, including India, have done it through export of goods and services rather than commodity dependence, as is the case of West Asia. And of course, this has really been achieved because of global competitiveness. And these are trends which are going to continue in spite of, you may say, the sort of retrogressive attempts by, in fact, people like the president of the US. At least let us hope that he is not going to continue as president. But in fact, as long as he is there, the really taken to the globalization process is not really going to change anything. And Asia is going to remain the main source both of rising markets and resource flows. Now, keeping this in mind, the operative issue is how much of these resources are in fact going to be made available to us. And we are already seeing that as far as China is concerned, they have themselves moved on from 2012 to 2020 in the initiatives they have taken. They were instrumental in setting up the Asian Infrastructure Bank with its capitalization of $50 billion and have already disbursed about $8 billion from there. And of course, now with the BRI initiative, in which a whole range of new sources of funding are really going to be put on the table. The China Development Bank, for instance, had up to 2018, in fact, actually lent out $190 billion to 600 projects. The China Export-Import Bank, with a capitalization, had lent out $150 billion. Then, of course, you had the Silk Road Fund with a capitalization of $40 billion. So these are going to be the major sources of financing, particularly for covering the now, we thought, about $750 billion infrastructure development gap in the Asian region. Now, in these circumstances, question would arise is that how does South Asia actually respond to this? At the moment, all these relationships have been on a largely ad hoc basis, dependent on their bilateral relations with China. But taking a comprehensive regional-centric view has been completely absent. South Asia had an opportunity to become a very active collective partner, apart from its individual participation in the BRI initiative, but its main partner, India, in fact, excluded itself from this particular opportunity. So here, the important issue would be now the way in which we react to these opportunities which actually exist. Now, what I would now say is that as far as South Asia is concerned, we need to not only use these opportunities, but to see how far the Chinese vision of moving from just becoming a lending opportunity to building the comprehensive economic partnerships, which were visualized by President Xi, in fact, when he was addressing the second big gathering of the BRI, I was in fact there at that time. And this, in fact, really becomes a working opportunity for us. Now, South Asia, in a way, is a very central element in the way in which infrastructure investments actually take place. We had a big opportunity through the BCIM initiative, or what we call the Kunming initiative, for, in fact, linking South Asia to East and Southeast Asia. But in fact, that did not get very far, so that all the developments have been moving very slowly on a bilateral basis. South Asia is very central to the infrastructure network which could be potentially constructed, because in fact, they are the link region between East and Southeast Asia on the one hand, and West Asia and Central Asia on the other. And in fact, the accessing of the energy resources through the construction of energy networks, as well as the road and transport infrastructure, is very dependent on how South Asia collectively relates to the East Asian initiative. Lastly, I want to conclude this by saying that having seen all these opportunities which exist, we still have very significant gaps which we in fact have not fulfilled within our own region. And this relates to the way in which we have effectively or ineffectively used development financing within the region. As we pointed out, one of our biggest sources of external financing, which was indigenous to us, was the remittance. Every country's main resource was coming in from remittances. But in fact, the way in which remittances have been handled has been, in fact, actually to leave it completely in private hands and to leave it completely to forces which never really attempted to use the collective capabilities which were inherent in the remittance inflows which were coming in. The role of governments, which would have been to, in fact, actually enhance the skills, finance the movements, convert individual movements of labor into collective corporate investments in service exports into the region. These were the potential opportunities which existed, which every government has really sort of failed in using this effectively. So that the inherent inability to both collectively utilize this, to create the necessary financial instruments, and to in fact build the institutions where some of these savings could in fact become major sources of investment there. In fact, in my paper, I talked about a number of opportunities, including the development of mutual funds for collectively utilizing remittances. Secondly, of course, we have been deficient in our effective investments in the small farm sector, which has been one of the main sources of growth, in the SME sector, which again has been a major driver, in the microfinance sector, which we have had huge opportunities of enhancing the scale of microfinancing by generating and building in opportunities for external economies through collective action, but in fact have kept them as microfinance players, and the huge opportunities which existed have gone by. I will round it off over here because what I'm trying to say here is that new opportunities have emerged, global structural changes have taken place. South Asia is at the center of these changes and can in fact benefit from it both in terms of enhanced resource flows and also in more effective use of the resources where it invests in all those deficits relating to the working elements of South Asia, which have been the main sources of our growth, and to in fact actually enhance both their capability and share in the growth process. Unfortunately, not only have we failed there, but we have invested in such a way that inequalities across South Asia have grown. And in fact, huge injustices now permeate the development process as we have observed it. How far we can bring about changes in the near future in response to the lessons we have learned from COVID is something which I hope can come up in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sobhan. I think it's a testament to your foresight that a paper you wrote in 2012, we literally just have to update the numbers and we can use it for our discussion today. So, I think we were very lucky to have you interpret that with today's lens. So thank you. I'm going to turn now to our panelists. And we really want to take stock of how COVID-19 has affected the fiscal space and how it's going to affect the development priorities. And we'll try and explore, some of the themes that Professor Sobhan brought up in terms of how can we strategize and address some of these funding constraints? How do we better organize ourselves? What are those things we should look for in this new sort of changed world order? So our first panelist is Dr. Salim Rehan. He's here with us, and Dr. Rehan is professor at the Department of Economics, University of Dhaka, and the executive director of the South Asia Network on Economic Modeling. He holds a PhD from the University of Manchester in the UK. He is the honorary senior research fellow at the University of Manchester. He is the alumni of the Harvard University's program on cutting edge of development thinking. Dr. Rehan possesses vast expertise in empirical research on international trade, economic growth, poverty, labor market, macroeconomic policies, political economy, and climate change issues. He has worked quite extensively on applied economics, especially assessing impacts of trade and economic policies using country-specific and global computable general equilibrium models, and micro and macro econometric modeling and estimation techniques. He has long experience in teaching international trade, economic modeling, quantitative economics, econometrics, development economics, and poverty dynamics. He has more than 15 years of experience in conducting international and national training programs on economic modeling in various countries, including Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Mongolia, Senegal, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. Dr. Rehan has published several journal articles, books, and working papers. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Rehan. So Bangladesh, like other South Asian countries, has been hit hard by the pandemic. But as the latest sort of World Bank South Asia focus pointed out, the Bangladesh economy performed well in the last fiscal despite COVID-19 impacts. Is this sustainable? And what is the outlook for the future? In this world, what does the future hold for some of the most pressing development challenges of the country? Pass it on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. And I must thank Sauti for inviting me to this very important program. And actually, after Professor Rehan Suman speaks, it is very difficult to add anything to the discussion. Honorable Chair, I appreciate your question. I thought that actually when I share my views, I will try to address your question. My first response would be that actually when you talk about this future of the development finance and in the context of South Asia, my first question is that have we got our development priorities right? We have seen kind of growth obsession in countries, in South Asian countries, and probably even if I talk about Bangladesh, probably have seen with the last few years, there is a kind of obsession on growth number. And also the fact is that we have seen the slow progress in different social indicators. Poor public expenditure on social sectors. I think these are very, very eminent now because of this COVID situation, especially on health sector. And we have seen that how exposed it has become during this pandemic. But when you talk about the SDGs, their targets are very steep, and also the requirements of resources very high. And actually there has been some estimates in Bangladesh that to meet the SDGs by 2030, the resources requirement can be around 25% of the GDP by 2030. So it's a huge requirement, no doubt. But my point I'd like to add here that I think that the COVID-19, we all would agree that the COVID-19 has actually intensified the challenges, and achieving the long-term development targets, especially under the SDGs by 2030, has become uncertain in most of the South Asian countries because of this situation, and we have the kind of crisis we are witnessing. The decade-long achievements in poverty reduction in these countries are under threat, and at the same time, inequality is on the rise. We are seeing that. I would really request whether there is a need to rethink the approaches to attaining the SDGs, given the new challenges brought out by the COVID-19. And I also think that the situation also calls for a renewed global discussion on development paradigms, since the post-COVID-19 world is not going to be the same as the pre-COVID-19 world. In terms of your question on the how did Bangladesh actually perform during this situation? We have a kind of mixed, I would say mixed performance. In the case of, I would not really go into the kind of debate on the growth rate, but whether the official growth rate, we have heard that about 8% of growth rate, and with the IMF growth rate is around 4%, or World Bank is saying 1.6%. But one factor is very clear that despite all the challenges among the countries which are actually registering some positive growth, Bangladesh is one of them. So in that case, it's a kind of, I would say, positive news. But my point would be when you talk about the broader development goals, that we need to look beyond this, as I said, the kind of growth numbers. Especially when you talk about financing these development issues. As Professor Hemant Sohan, he rightly pointed out, there are two major financing sources: domestic financing source and external financing sources. And in the case of domestic sources, we can actually explain that the low tax GDP ratio in Bangladesh is actually contributing to the low spending of the social sectors, especially on the health and education, and also on the social protection. So that is one area, but also at the same time, I also think that there is a kind of problem with getting our priorities right. So we haven't seen much effort in reforming the tax administration or tax institutions, and we are stuck at a kind of 8 to 9% of GDP with the tax revenue, the ratio of tax revenue to GDP over for a long period. And with this very low tax GDP ratio, it's extremely difficult to actually mobilize domestic resources and finance the larger development goals. But I'd like to bring in one more important point in terms of domestic financing. I think this is the role of the private sector in financing the development issues. How do you make private sector accountable? And we have seen in this crisis too, actually, especially with respect to the health crisis, health hazard, we have seen that the private healthcare system completely fails during this kind of pandemic. So, and if I bring another example, especially with respect to the working condition or ensuring a decent job, it is mostly the responsibility of the private sector. How do you actually ensure the working condition, proper working condition and decent job at the factory level? And private sector in Bangladesh, and if we bring the case of the ready-made garments, we all know the Rana Plaza incidents, and after the Rana Plaza incident, the kind of structural change the ready-made garment sector also went through. But the general feeling is that actually they think it's a kind of additional cost to them when it comes to improving the working condition or ensuring working condition at the factory level. So that the point is that how do you really make this private sector accountable? What kind of institutional setup, what kind of political economy incentives should be there to make it happen? My final point would be here that Professor Sohan very nicely talked about the ODA issues, the remittance. I think there is no point of disagreement with him. In terms of FDI, and we all agree that the South Asia is not a good recipient of FDI. I just want to give you one example of the comparison between Bangladesh and Vietnam. During mid-80s, Bangladesh and Vietnam had almost the similar level of FDI. But now you can see that Vietnam is receiving annually more than $12 billion, and Bangladesh is in the range of $2 to $3 billion annual recipient of FDI. So then what really happened over the last 3 decades? Why was not Bangladesh able to attract this kind of FDI? And I think we all will agree that FDI can be a very useful instrument in actually achieving many of the development goals, what we are talking about. So I think we need to look back, we need to see, and we need to look at the kind of business environment. We need to look at the kind of institutional environment in countries in South Asia, why we are not a great recipient of FDI. And very finally, I think the point made by Professor Sobhan on the challenges of the political economy issues of getting the finances from China or India. This is a very kind of, it has become, I think, beyond the kind of economic issues and the geopolitical issues, which is, I think, I would say, it's not really highlighting the major development challenge, the major requirement of the South Asian countries. We are not really looking at the economic needs of the South Asian countries, rather than we are focusing more on the geopolitical issues. I think countries in South Asia, they need to look beyond the narrow geopolitical interest. And if they can actually tap on the financing opportunities which are coming out from Belt and Road Initiative or different other initiatives, I think they can actually be benefited. I'll stop here, Madam Chairman, and over to you.
Thank you so much. This is, I think what struck me was, your point of we have to look beyond the growth numbers, and we have to rethink our development priorities, perhaps. So I think that's something for all of us to take home. I'm going to turn now to Mr. Nazir Kabiri, who's the Executive Director at the Biruni Institute in Kabul. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Kabiri. Mr. Kabiri is the Executive Director of the Biruni Institute, as I said. He previously served as a Senior Policy Advisor to the Finance Minister of Afghanistan for over 6 years. Mr. Kabiri advised the Minister of Finance on a broad range of policy issues that included input on the government's major reform agendas, public finance management, aid effectiveness, capacity building, and regional economic cooperation. He was also a key interlocutor in the Ministry of Finance for international institutions and bilateral donors. Mr. Kabiri has been working in Afghanistan with NGOs and government institutions since 2002, including 5 years with the UK government's DFID, Department for International Development. Mr. Kabiri holds a degree in management from South Korea, a bachelor's in economics from Kabul University, and a master's degree in development economics as a Fulbright scholar from the US. He frequently appears in the media speaking on issues related to the Afghan economy and regional issues. Thank you so much, Mr. Kabiri. So I guess what we're all curious to ask you is, how has COVID affected the availability of development finance in Afghanistan? I know as Professor Sobhan had mentioned, Afghanistan is one of the countries that is probably more heavily ODA dependent than the rest of South Asia. But what is COVID going to do for the development journey in Afghanistan? Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for the very kind introduction, Ms. Chair. I also appreciate the opportunity to be here amongst you today. And at the same time, it's a privilege being in the company of His Excellency Rahman Sobhan, a distinguished scholar in this region. And similarly, I want to thank my friend, Mr. Pandey, for the initiative to bring us all together to discuss some of the prominent issues concerning the region. At the same time, before I answer that question, perhaps I would advise on 3 items in the agenda that I will be discussing with you today. First, a quick situation analysis or a country update on Afghanistan. The second, I will be discussing some ideas on the future of development finance. And third, I'll be having a few humble recommendations. To start with, the situation in Afghanistan being as such that the country's economy was even fragile before the COVID-19 pandemic. Growth has averaged only around less than 3% since 2012 due to the combined impacts of declining grants, increasing insecurity, and political instability. The COVID pandemic has plunged the Afghan economy into a deep recession. The economy is projected, according to our projections here at the Institute, to contract by 8.2% in 2020, with the poverty rate forecast to have increased from nearly 55% in 2017 to around 80% in 2020. This means that around 8 million additional people would fall below the poverty line, increasing the number of poor to 24 million out of 33 million population. Revenue collection has affected by the economic slowdown, worsening the prospects for medium-term fiscal sustainability. Grants equal to around 43% of GDP continue to finance more than 75% of total public spending and around half of the budget expenditure. Current civilian aid pledges expire in December 2020, and future levels of grants support are not yet known. And grants may decline rapidly over the coming years due to the changing donor priorities and also due to some dissatisfaction with the pace of anti-corruption and reforms over governance. Furthermore, the ongoing peace process and the upcoming donor pledging conference in November 2020 this year in Geneva add to the growing complexities for economic management during the crisis. Moving further to the second item in my agenda in discussing the future of development finance, Your Excellency, Madam Chair, on the high levels of dependence on ODA, as rightly pointed out by Dr. Rahman Subhan, in South Asia region, Afghanistan is an outlier, where aid to GDP ratio stands near to 43% of GDP. This means that the nature of Afghan economy is very different than the rest of us in South Asia. In case of Afghanistan, ODA is still a decisive variable in influencing our levels of development. ODA indeed is the principal source of development financing in Afghanistan. But given that donors currently fund 75% of total public spending in Afghanistan, including on and off budget expenditure in both security and development sectors, analysis by the World Bank and that of the Biruni Institute suggests that financing gap will continue to decline to only 18% of GDP, but still equivalent to another 8 billion by 2030. This means that the country will continue to rely on donor assistance for foreseeable future. But given the Corona pandemic, it's a great opportunity, I think, to revisit the structures and effectiveness principles of international aid regime. OECD could be possibly a lead on this. But moving forward, the quality of aid is very important for us. Similarly, at the same time, our experience in Afghanistan suggests that not much of an effort can help to change the behavior of international aid regime. It's the philosophy of gift, either take it or leave it. On the possibility of private sector, perhaps, or innovative development financing, as discussed by Dr. Rahman Subhan, I agree that the source of external finances beyond ODA are becoming more prominent. I also note that the attempts to mobilize private sector resources in the name of innovative development financing are also not very innovative. But in Afghan context, we feel that there is some room. The war billionaires and millionaires in Afghanistan, so many of them would find a peaceful situation post the negotiations, an interesting situation to invest back in their own country. So we do have some potential in terms of domestic financing in future if peace prevails. Similarly, post-peace FDI is going to be important in Afghanistan in terms of the mining industry and the mining sector in general. And lastly, in terms of a few humble recommendations, Mr. Chair, and dear participants and colleagues and scholars, as you all rightly know, PPP and blended investment schemes could be an opportunity to tap into, learning from experience of India and rest of our countries, our neighbors, particularly China, could be an interesting domain to further explore and identify the degree of readiness within all these South Asian countries. Debt forgiveness is another agenda one could further explore. Debt should be written off for LDCs and LIC in conflict-affected countries could be considered. Easiness and borrowing could be another agenda to consider moving forward post-COVID. LICs should have more access to concessionary multilateral loans on better terms and conditions than ever before. And similarly, on the regional cooperation as a source of joint investment for some of us in this neighborhood, our understanding here in Afghanistan is that COVID-19 doesn't have much of a chance to unlock the full potential of regional cooperation. And the chances for COVID to unlock the full potential is very low. Similarly, COVID-19 will not encourage regionalism, as we just see the current trend. It will further encourage inward nationalistic policies. And at the same time, COVID is not going to change any geopolitical fault lines in South Asia. But on a positive note, peace is have a chance for potential regional cooperation. As some of you might be following the developments in Afghanistan, we are taking steps towards that direction. And our understanding is that peace in the region will unlock the full potential of regional cooperation that could promote cross-border economic cooperation among the South Asian countries, where trade and investment projects are capable of contributing to economic growth, job creation, income generation, and confidence building in the wider Central, South, and Southwest Asia and beyond. With this, peace be upon you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kebe. I think, of course, peace is a prerequisite, and we all, hope and pray that we're able to take it for granted at some time soon. On the private sector mobilization, this is something that is very close to our heart. This is what we do and what we propose. And I think it's, again, a good reminder to bring in what Dr. Rehan was saying, that, we need to make sure also we have frameworks that hold the private sector accountable. So we need to have the regulatory and the accountability frameworks firmly in place. But thank you very much. Our final panelist today is Dr. Prabir De. He is the Professor for Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries in New Delhi. Professor De is also the head of ASEAN India Center, AIC, RIS. He is also an adjunct fellow of the National Maritime Foundation in New Delhi, the Institute of Chinese Studies in ICS, New Delhi, and South Asia Network of Economic Modeling in Dhaka. Dr. De works in the field of international economics and has research interests in international trade and development. He was a visiting fellow of the Institute of Developing Economies in Japan, Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo, and visiting senior fellow of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok. He obtained an MSc in economics from Calcutta University and a PhD in economics from Jadavpur University, Kolkata. He has contributed several research papers in international journals and written books on trade and development. His recent book includes Act East to Act Indo-Pacific, India's Expanding Neighborhood, which was published in New Delhi in 2020. He's also edited a volume with Mr. Salim Rehan on trade and regional integration in South Asia, a tribute to Saman Kelegama, who a distinguished Sri Lankan economist, which was published by Springer in Singapore. He is the founding editor of the Journal of Asian Economic Integration. Professor De, welcome and thank you for joining us. We were hoping that you would talk to us about post-COVID trade, value chains, and connectivity, and how all of that ties into the development finance challenges, or how that could tie into the development finance challenges for the countries. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. And, Good evening from New Delhi, and thank you, Swati, and all the organizers giving me an opportunity to speak in the last series, the webinars they did in the last 1 month or so. And it's a great pleasure listening Professor Rehman Soban and the colleagues with whom I've been working, Salim Raihan and of course Nazir Kabiri. And I can see in the panel those who are participating, so many common friends like Posraj Pandey and many others. So thank you very much. It is a great opportunity for me to come here and speak. Now, I was listening to Professor Soban, and it is a really challenging task for us to raise to the level, So he gave us quite a broad overview. You wrote a paper in 2012, and I'm sorry that we could not even, that time thinking about the development finance kind of a changing profile or profile for South Asia in 2012. So, and he is reading that paper in which he wrote in almost about a decade back today. So thank you very much, sir, and for giving your wisdom and giving, presenting us an excellent, very, very stimulating paper. Looking forward to work more, in case opportunity arises. Now, coming to the post-COVID trade and value chain scenario, there are papers, there are new studies. I happen to work for a recent work with the team of experts working on post-COVID trade facilitation, and I looked at some of the numbers. So when you go to the development financing opportunities, this time, because we look at crisis is an opportunity, and of course this is a great serious concern for everybody. But I look at, or many for that matter, they look at current crisis and opportunity. Now, to unlock such opportunity, if you look at through the trade, investment, and other areas in the economic relations, it's obvious that new numbers tells that regional trade, interregional trade, what we had in 2019, which is around 34 billion US dollar, the total regional trade in terms of exports, it has come down, likely to be reaching 30 billion US dollar. And as you know, that this is just interregional trade is not so important, because South Asia interregional trade is almost about 8 to 6%. But what is the main concern is the rest, out of the 8 South Asian countries, remaining 7 countries that depend on India very much for their trade and for their several other areas, they depend on very much on India. So any kind of an economic crisis happened, or any kind of a decline of economic sizes in this crisis period, this is a big challenge for all the member countries in the SAARC or in South Asia, not just in the trade, but also in other areas, which I found, and many others for that matter, that for an investment on which Salim, Dr. Raihan, and then Nazir Kabiri, and of course Professor Rehman Soban spoke about a lot, that the investment has declined, and we've seen that the value chain, be it a textile or any other products, garments for that matter, and the value chain also slowed down, not because simply that coronavirus-led pandemic, because of the disruption of the supply chains and like that. At the moment, what we see that connectivity in the South Asian region is fragmented, and there are discussions how to link these countries again and coming back much stronger. And we see there is a special development financing suggestion, or maybe a funding suggestion from member countries on the 15th of March, and very, very early period of the, when we had a lockdown, and soon after the COVID outbreak, the SAARC development special fund, COVID finance. So these are, this is the SAARC initiative, which thereafter I see several other countries, perhaps globally or sub-regional, regionally, they also introduced new arrangements, in terms of development finance like SARC funding. So what we see in when it comes to the trade and where there's a scope for new innovative financing options, what do we see that in during January to I have the figure January to August, and these countries, South Asian countries, they came out with a new initiatives in terms of trade facilitation, sustainable development goal, innovations. And for example, the country like Bangladesh or maybe in India, they never thought that they are going to, they never thought that they will allow the submission of certificate of origin, for example, the SAFTA certificate of origin online. They never thought about it. This was allowed by Bangladesh and also by India and many other countries. So when the crisis happened, countries were forced to come out with a new innovative ideas. That's what we found. Now, this is sort of a temporary. And during January to August, South Asian region, 446 new measures they have introduced. Of course, there are some overlaps. India leads in 150, Bangladesh is 53, Sri Lanka and 85, like that. Most of the measures, they are looked at in the simplification of custom procedures and expedited customs clearance. But I was told when we spoke to those who are using international trade, those who are part of the trade arrangements, they said these are the temporary arrangement. They may disappear again. They will undo everything, the governments, and then will bring back kind of the old regime. So what is the point here is that we have a crisis happened. The countries took innovative measures in the trade facilitation, in several other areas, but there is a fear in the private sector that these will be undo when the crisis disappears or this pandemic subsides. So this is kind of a very, very interesting situation, and we must be very concerned about it. And this is not just a common for in trade facilitation in the area. It is also in economic areas, also in other areas like investment cooperation, like that. Now from here, where do we go and how do we look at the students' conversation that we have in the webinar? That I go with the other panels, that let's have some recommendations of takeaways, in case we need to strengthen the development financing in the South Asia regions. Now it's true, and as the other previous speakers, they said that this is a crisis time. People, households, be it corporate or individual, they have a tendency to have more savings. Savings rates almost all across the countries have gone up, but if you have more savings, less investment, there will be disequilibrium. So there is not much taker of the commercial, retail loan across the country because there is a fear in the mind, lots of risks. If we take loan, we'll be able to pay it back, like that. And Madam Chair, you know it very well that you are a banker. So how much and what's actually the real situation? There is a rise of the non-performing assets as well for the retail banks and financial institution across all the countries. This is a big challenge. Then how do you get it back, or will you or the countries come forward in the name of a stimulus will remove all these old burden and come and start fresh? So this is, I leave a thought here for more discussions. So what we do, for South Asia as a region to start a kind of a new scenario or to unlock a new scenario that we see in this period, is that we need to pull all our resources together, 8 countries, and we know very well there are differences between the member countries, and I don't have to tell which are the member countries, you know it very well. So when it comes to a regional organizations, regional funding, this may not work because great example we have in a SARC development fund, and you know very well that yet the member countries yet to yet to appoint a chief executive officer of the SARC development fund for almost about 1 year because of differences of opinion over the member countries. This is very common everywhere, that if member country comes from a particular country, another country will not cooperate. If like that, it goes on in a spiraling, and there is a no stop about it. So I'm not very much hopeful about the SARC kind of thing. Professor Sobon, Professor Muchkund Dubey, and all other, senior people or our veterans, they were the eminent group persons. They gave out a roadmap. Ever they thought that they will have to see this kind of a scenario almost about their 20 years after they wrote the eminent person group? No. So it is a very pity, and I'm very sorry to say this, but this is the reality. So how do we then go from here to unlock these huge opportunities coming as a crisis? Is there any scope to, again, the pulling together all resources of South Asian countries? I'm not hopeful about the government coming forward and giving development aid. India is possible, but as you know that if the tax not domestically well collected, because this time people are not paying taxes. Let's be very frank about it. As you know that our tax return in country in India, which is very fixed about the July, it has been now extended to November. So every country same scenario. If a tax is not coming, how do you generate revenue? So this is a big situation. So I think the countries will be very cautious going to its neighborhood with paying, with the charity or with the name of any kind of development finance. It would be prioritized. That's what I think. And it's quite natural. We call it a China or United States of America or any European countries or for that matter, Japan or India. Next is, so we need to look at, in this case, what would be the role of, and I finish with 1 more minute, what would be the role of, development banks that we have. I remind you that when we had a global financial crisis, and before that, there was an Asian crisis in 1997. The Chinese, they realized, because they looked at the crisis as an opportunity. By calling a Chinese, I just present this is their theory, and their other aspects, political aspects. Sorry, I don't discuss. So this is an opportunity both for 1996 and then when it came to the global financial crisis 2007-8. I think there's a big international institutions came in. It's called AIIB, and India is one of the subscribers. So and when you have a fund, you also need a bank, right? Bank and fund, they have to go together with like IMF and the World Bank. So we have an AIIB, we have an Asian Development Bank, and these banks are, very well. If nobody goes to them, this bank will fail. Where the retail bank, well, everybody goes there, our retail banks will collapse. So now this is a big issue that this ADB, World Bank, AIIB, they are also very cautious because countries are not approaching them just for other purpose of activities. Only they are going to asking for free money to deal with the current crisis. So what about the crisis leaves, and then how do you deal with the wreckage that it left behind, and then how we go from there, encouraging our trade, encouraging our regional cooperation, integration. So what should be the kind of arrangements? So this is only those banks are can drive, because they have resources, capacity, capabilities. They can drive all this. Plus, there is a role big nations like in India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. If we can contribute to some way, create a fund, which is basically a development fund, but not typically arranged by the bureaucratic way. I think there are opportunities. If you look at Africa 50-50 fund, where development finance they give, including IFC, and then it is managed by African Development Bank, and that money is lended to the purely on the commercial basis based on the merit. That kind of fund, if SARC think to bring to support private sectors, which is doing business, which is IFC primarily doing, but IFC normally looks at national, not cross-border one, if there is any possibility. And then, I conclude that perhaps the SARC Development Fund, SARC Development Bank, whatever in the name of SARC, except the Secretariat, they will, if the countries do not shake hand, these will disappear. Simply, this will be a place for employment for some people, but this will be equally a burden for the nations because you won't subscribe them anymore. So you need to bring out, this is a crisis, as I said, AIIB example. This is a crisis time. Maybe South Asian countries, think for looking at bigger nations, bring them here some kind of funding arrangements, which will part of an ADB or part of AIIB or part of World Bank or the regional funding arrangements, which go into giving to private sectors for their own business, because tiny, small, medium enterprises, they have lost their jobs, lost their businesses. They are the more prime concern. And then those who will be doing more into digital systems, using digital systems through, in the South Asia regions, more driven by the market, those would be required as special arrangements. So I stop there, and then, we will join for any questions there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Day. I think it's a good reminder that never let a good crisis go to waste, and really there's for the least integrated region in the world, it's sad to see you not have more hope for our integration, but I think that's the reality. So it's good for all of us to hear it. Okay, so we were going to talk about some other things, but there is a bunch of questions, I'm told, that we'd like to go through. And I know Dr. Rehan has to leave us a little early. So Mr. Karel, would you like to go through the questions?
Sure. So there is, so I'll just go through the questions. So the first question is by Mr. Keshav Bhattrai. So the question is posted on the chat box. Is it possible to start a South Asian Development Bank and South Asian stock market for mobilizing resources for investment? Obviously, growing need for funds by the private sector cannot be sufficiently provided by public sector. Hence, he's asking whether a South Asian Development Bank is possible or feasible. And this is to everyone, actually. And there is a question to Professor Sobhan by Dr. Mustafizur Rahman. Are you concerned about procurement rules, suppliers' credit nature of a large part of finance, interest rate, debt sustainability, and overall governance as regards China's development finance? So shall I go on with the question? Okay.
I think, should we let people respond and then maybe take the next two?
Yes.
Okay. So any one of our panelists who'd like to respond, maybe Dr. Day, since you were talking about it, South Asian Development Bank and South Asian stock market, is that something that's realistic and viable?
As I said, there is already, SAARC Development Bank, it is headquartered in Bhutan, and anything you do, on a South Asia Stock Exchange, these are the, not the old, not the new ideas. These are there, but as I said, if you go for a government, type of arrangements, multilateral, then I am not very hopeful, because there are differences on the SAARC members that, anything we have done so far in the name of SAARC, be it SAARC University, SAARC Secretariat, SAARC Seed Bank, SAARC, all in last, all have now basically, because of the differences of the member countries. They have a brilliant people, I'm not talking about them, because of difference of the member countries, and it doesn't work. So I'm not very hopeful on that whether do you need to have a SAARC Development Bank or SAARC South Asian Stock Exchange, or stock market. Yes, if you do anything with the privately, leaving aside the government arrangements, privately, the private sector corporations, there is a hope. I'm sure, that there is a hope.
Thank you, Professor Sobhan. Can I come to you about with the second question?
Yeah, actually, if you look at the protocols of the Asian in AIIB, they in fact are quite advanced and sophisticated in terms of the protocols they have actually set up and the discipline they are attempting to maintain in their lending operations. I mean, they are trying to develop it as a international standard multilateral bank. I have no idea how it works in actual practice, but certainly from the way in which even the international institutions, I was reading the work on multilateral financing, this paper which has come out recently, seems to think that they have in fact developed this to quite high professional standards. For the other lending operations which are really going on under the BRI initiative, these are much more open-ended because these are not governed by any sort of international ground rules, but really by the ground rules of the particular financing institutions which are there. And at the moment, there is really very little literature that we know about it. All we know about is what is going on in individual countries, where particular institutions like the Export-Import Bank are in fact financing projects. Now, I think none of this part is really going to be addressed unless the BRI is willing to be involved in a broader discussion of the comprehensive economic partnership model, because this will be then a systemic arrangement where you can then look to lay down ground rules of how it will actually function, and where all the relevant players will then have to be institutionalized, institutionally connected to this particular process. As long as the BRI, in fact, really remains a series of individual projects worked out bilaterally between particular countries in China, you are really going to have a whole different set of ground rules with very mixed possibilities coming out of it. So essentially, it depends on whether we let China go ahead and carry out its own arrangements, or we try and do what they have actually asked us to do. In fact, this was the central element of the President Xi's address, that you have to really see this as a much broader, comprehensive economic partnership, which is constructed around restructuring both trade and investment opportunities, and to in fact link this up with the investment financing arrangements which are in place, where you can then build in the disciplines that have been established in the Asia Infrastructure Bank. And I think for us, it is very important for India in particular, and Japan also, who are both in fact keeping out of the BRI network, to in fact actually come in and become players, as they have actually, as India has done in the Asian Infrastructure Bank, to in fact really make a much more institutionalized set of working arrangements for the way in which it will go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Sobhan. I think we had a comment from Mr. Siddiqui on the earlier question, saying Bangladesh and Pakistan, along with China, is at the restricted list for investment in India without security clearance. So operating a stock exchange or a bank wouldn't work, and even the private sector might be unable to work smoothly. So thank you for that, Mr. Siddiqui. We have another question, and that was addressed to Dr. Day. How do you see prospects of sub-regional cooperation if SARC-level national cooperation is not working, as you have rightly mentioned? Dr. Day, any?
Yeah, thank you. I think that is, when you do the sub-regional, and this has been allowed in within the SARC treaty, that member countries can have the sub-regional programs. See, the SARC, or for that matter, any kind of a regional organization, these are nothing but a club. Their member countries, they come, sometimes they don't renew their club memberships. But these members, they only get an interest to these regional blocks if they are thriving. So since South Asia, in the name of a SARC, there are differences, not giving us, kind of an environment that we expected in the areas of trade, investment, and economic relations. So member countries now, they need to find out another blocks or another kind of a club in that sense. So, and we have seen if it is an open type, open regionalism, that anybody can come in and anybody can walk out. So that works pretty well like APEC. We have, there is no binding commitment by anybody. And there is no kind of a dispute settlement. If there is a fault by any member countries, another member country or another member, they cannot drag them to a dispute settlement. So in today's time, in South Asia, the sub-regional arrangements, like 3 or 4 members, like BBI in Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, this is doing well, relatively speaking, because it is a kind of an open, no secretariat. It is called by the ministries of a particular division of a particular ministry, issue-based, and they have started well, like in BBIN, but there are again, some members, they have changed their position, and so it's kind of a mixed environment, mixed development so far BBIN is concerned. But in other areas, when we see the in Pacific cooperation in countries in the Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, or in the in ASEAN, for example, IMTGT or BIMP IEGA, where they go subnationally, pick up particular areas where there are wider benefits, they come out well. With a small office, even secretariat is not there, they're given the responsibility to Asian Development Bank to take care of everything. So there's a running well, Anyway, to cut short on my concluded part, that these regional or sub-regional corporations all depend on the members' wish, and there is ups and downs are always there. So in case today South Asia is not doing well, they can do it in the future, or if it is sub-regional cooperation within South Asia doing pretty well, it may land into a trouble in tomorrow. So this is what I would say. But they can do pretty, coming out with many good benefits in sub-regionally when there is a geographical contiguity or they are connected by ocean. That's what I found. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Day. We have a few more questions, and I'm going to ask the panelists to please keep the responses short so we can get through all of them. So there was a question from Mr. Pandey on what is your views on plugging leakages, reining in corruption, controlling illicit capital flows, and containing unnecessary government expenditure, etc., as a source of development finance. I know, Dr. Rehan, you've commented on that. Would you like to come in briefly and just give us your thoughts? I know you have to go then.
Oh, thank you so much, Madam Chair. Actually, yes, I wrote on the chat box. I think that, okay, definitely we'll always have to fight against corruption and illicit capital outflows. And probably the kind of weak institutions we are seeing in our countries, that we are not very good at that, in terms of fighting against corruption. So that pressure from civil society, the pressure from different stakeholders should be there on the government to fight against corruption, illicit money. But again, the problem is, if you talk about financing development issues, I'm not very sure about how much resources we can actually generate out of it. Because we are dealing with smart people. Once you have a drive against them, they will be smarter and they will know how to evade. So, strategies, our development strategies can't be based on, this kind of thing. But I fully agree with Dr. Pandey about cutting down unnecessary government expenditure. That's what I also, shared my views in the chat box. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Biggs has a question to the panel. Do the speakers see emerging national regional policies emerging to encourage equitable economic development in rural areas with, for example, trade in rural capital goods from China? So are we seeing policies that are encouraging equitable economic development in rural areas? Would any of the panelists like to jump in on this?
Well, I would say that the answer to that is a very simple one, and I would say no. There are no such policies. And in fact, I think we are a region which is in fact consumed with elite-dominated development agendas, which in fact, both in terms of the way they allocate revenues as also the way in which they allocate bank financing perpetuate inequalities. And because of poor regulation, you don't then recover money. So these end up as, in fact, open-ended subsidies to the same elite class. So in these circumstances, the question of equitable strategies in the rural areas is in fact about the more remotest of possibilities over here. I mean, there are many ideas on the table in which you could actually do that, including the broader issue of generating value addition for small farmers. I've written quite a lot about that in my book on challenging injustice. One of my favorite examples, of course, is the Amol experience, where you are in fact integrating large numbers of small cattle farmers and vertically integrating them into the value addition process, so that Amol as a corporate entity is in fact one of the largest food producing companies in India. And you are getting the primary producers to share value in that particular process. But not a great deal has been done to go down that particular road. So as I said, whilst we can give many ideas on the subject, the de facto answer of what has happened is very little.
Thank you, Professor Sarban. And I think, again, COVID will exacerbate those inequalities, I guess. Mr. Krishna Pant has a question again to the panel, and this is our last one. So COVID-19 has decreased consumptions of almost all items except foods and health services. How does this affect private sector investment and FDI? Anyone on the panel would like to take this?
Perhaps you should answer it.
On FDI, certainly I can take a stab at it. I don't think I have the deep expertise that all of you do, but it has decreased consumption and food and health services. But in this case, health services, as actually the panel pointed out earlier, private sector health services have not always they haven't shown in this environment, So how is this going to affect private sector putting in more money into health as FDI? I think it'll be difficult. I think the models will have to change. There are private sectors now going to flow towards things like exploring digital health. I think FDI could flow through in terms of vaccinations, etc. Food, there's a surge towards self-reliance, I think. So I think a lot more countries are going to be looking at what benefits them in terms of food supply or agriculture for their own population. I think priorities have changed a little in the pandemic. They're looking to see, how can this earn us foreign exchange? The first thing is, how can we get more self-reliant? That may be the question. So I don't know if FDI will be the answer to that or domestic investment, but yes, food, I mean, we all need it. That is going to be a growing area, but whether, which is the source of investment that comes into it, it's hard to tell right now. So I think with that, can I pass it back to Mr. Carroll to close out? And before I do, thank you very much to the panel. It was a pleasure to participate with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Arif. Now, Dr. Pushpa Sarma, Executive Director, SOTI, will present the closing remarks.
Thank you, Paras. Thank you, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Rehman Soban. It's a great pleasure, sir, that you were with us. It's always a great thing to hear your views. Our special thanks also to Ms. Amina Arif, Dr. Salim Rayan, Dr. Prabir Dey, Mr. Najir Kabiri. I think there was some food for thought for every one of us today. As we end the webinar series, as it was also said that this is the 8th and the last one of the series that we have been organizing, We would like to thank all the moderators, the keynote speakers, the panelists of all the 8 sessions that we have had so far. We would also like to thank all the participants for very actively participating. We think the issues, the insights that we have received from these 8 webinar series, perhaps there have been some policy inputs that we have been able to provide to policymakers in the context of COVID-19, because we have covered quite a huge areas in these 8 webinars. And we also think that we have also got some ideas for policy research and advocacy in the days to come, because the impact of COVID-19, I think it's going to remain for a very long time. And there will be a lot of things to do as think tanks, as researchers. There's a lot I think that we have to do, and we hope we have got inputs for our future work from these webinar series. Let me also take this opportunity to thank our co-organizers for collaborating with us, Biruni Institute from Afghanistan, CPD from Bangladesh, RIS from India, SDPI Pakistan, and IPS from Sri Lanka. It has always been a pleasure to partner, to collaborate with our members and partners organizations in undertaking these kinds of policy dialogues. And we are very thankful to our partners this time as well. Personally, I would like to thank our chair, Dr. Poshraj Pandey, for the overall guidance and support that he has provided for this webinar. Our special thanks to Dr. Ratnakar Adhikari and Dr. Mona Shrestha Adhikari as well, because we have received a lot of support in various forms for this webinar series. And my personal thanks also to my colleagues who have worked very hard to make this webinar series a success, specifically to name them: Dr. Paras Kharel, Diksha Singh, Chitish Dahal, Avinash Gupta, Ankur Singh, Alabir Dahal, Pravina Maharjan, Nina Shrestha. Thank you all for a very hard work. You all had to work even out of office hours, as we are even now at this time. And a little bit of information, the summary of our proceedings of all the webinar series, these are available on our website, sauti.org. The videos are also available on our YouTube channel at Sauti on YouTube. So if you have missed any of the sessions, you can go to our website or our YouTube channel to catch up. Finally, Dashain, as we call in Nepal, in India it is also called Dasera or Navratri. This is starting tomorrow. So we are just at the cusp of this festival, but we are also amidst this COVID-19 pandemic. Nepal has been hit very hard lately. It's the same with all the countries in South Asia. So whoever is celebrating this festival, our best wishes to everyone. On behalf of Sauti, I'm extending this best wishes to everyone. Celebrate it with care, with precautions. Hopefully we will get to celebrate it even more, a better way next year and onwards. So with this, we close today's session. We close the webinar series. I thank you all once again, and I wish you all a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Posh.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. It was nice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello. Oh, Stephen Biggs was in the port transition.
Oh, where is Stephen Biggs?
He was there on this.
Oh.
Take a note.